They say houses remember. Stone absorbs grief, timber carries whispers, and the earth beneath remembers every footstep, every scream. The Holloway Estate was not simply a home, it was a mausoleum of secrets, where madness rotted the mind and history refused to stay buried. The first sight of it was always the same, an overwhelming stillness, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Its windows, tall and narrow, glared outward like eyes that had seen too much. The roof sagged beneath the weight of years, but the chimneys still stood like blackened sentinels. Ivy crawled up its sides, choking the bricks, as though nature itself had tried to strangle what lingered within, and failed. Travelers spoke of it in hushed tones, never by name, only as the house on the hill. Carriages avoided its path. Children dared each other to touch its gate and run, shrieking with nervous laughter that never reached their eyes. For 3 generations, no family remained within its walls for long. Some fled in silence, abandoning their belongings. Others left under darker circumstances, carried down the hill in coffins. The Holloway Estate was built in 1811 by Jonathan Holloway, a shipping magnate whose fortune was earned not in trade but in shadows. His ships carried more than grain and textiles. They carried misery, stolen lives, and unspoken sins across the sea. It was said he constructed the manor not as a home but as a fortress against his own guilt. He filled its halls with imported marble, rare woods and paintings of somber saints who watched every room with unyielding judgment. Yet grandeur could not silence the echoes. Servants whispered of strange draughts in rooms with no windows, of doors that swelled shut, trapping them inside until the wood relented. At night, when all should have been still, footsteps rang along the corridors, measured and deliberate, though no one walked them. Jonathan himself descended into a madness that blurred grief and guilt into one indistinguishable torment. His journals, what few survived, told of visions, pale faces peering from behind curtains, hands that brushed his shoulder in empty rooms, voices that whispered his name from the cracks in the walls. He wrote of the house as though it were alive, its stones drinking in his confessions, its beams bending under the weight of his lies. When Jonathan was found hanging from the central stairwell, his eyes bulging and his neck grotesquely twisted, the town whispered it was not his hand that tightened the noose. The coroner wrote suicide in tidy script, but the servants who washed the blood from the banister swore they saw marks upon his wrists, as if hands had held him fast. The estate passed to his son, then his grandson. Each in turn tried to live within it, to make the house their own. Each was broken by it. By the late 19th century, the Holloway name was little more than a curse. The family scattered, and the house stood vacant. Its windows shuttered, its halls silenced, but silence does not mean peace. For in a house like Holloway, absence is only another kind of haunting. The villagers claimed that at dusk, the house seemed to exhale, a low groan that carried across the fields. Farm animals would shy away from its boundary, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling. Those who dared step across the iron gate swore they felt the ground pulse beneath their feet, as though something beneath the soil shifted in restless sleep. There were rumors of children who vanished near the estate, their cries swallowed by the wind, lovers who strayed into its garden, never to be seen again. Priests blessed its threshold with holy water. But the wood drank it dry, and still the air reeked of damp earth and old grief. By the turn of the century, the estate had become a story parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far at night. Stay away from Holloway, they would warn. The house remembers more than it should. But stories, no matter how dark, have a way of drawing those who hunger for truth. And truth in places like Holloway is seldom a gift. It is a wound waiting to be reopened. For the Holloway estate was not empty. It was waiting. And soon, someone would answer its call. The first to return was not a Holloway at all, but Eleanor Whitford, a historian whose fascination with forgotten tragedies drew her to the manor's gates. She was young, though grief had carved its lines across her face early. She had lost her husband to fever, her child to stillbirth. The world offered her little solace, but in the pages of history, in the ruin of old places, she found fragments of understanding. When Eleanor first stepped onto the overgrown path leading to Holloway, she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being observed. The wind stilled, the crows above fell silent, and the air pressed heavy upon her chest, as though the house itself weighed her heart in its palm. She did not turn back. Grief has a way of numbing fear. The key turned stiff in the lock. The door groaned open. Dust billowed outward, carrying with it the scent of mold and rot. The entry hall yawned before her, vast and dark, its marble floor cracked, its chandeliers clothed in cobwebs. Yet beneath the decay lingered the suggestion of grandeur, like the faded features of a corpse that once was beautiful. Her footsteps echoed, once, twice, 3 times, then another, softer, not her own. She froze. The air thickened, cold against her skin. She whispered to herself, as though the sound of her own voice might keep her anchored. Stone absorbs grief. Timber carries whispers. She closed the door behind her, sealing herself in. And the house sighed. Eleanor could not know then what the rest of the village already believed, that the Holloway Estate was less a ruin than a living thing, and that every sorrow within its walls fed something older, darker, patient beyond imagining. But what is patience to a house that does not age, that remembers every tear, every prayer unanswered, every scream cut short? What is grief, when time itself cannot dull its edge? Tell me, if a house can remember sin, then how long before it demands penance? The Holloway Estate rises from the fog-choked hills of Derbyshire, its silhouette a jagged wound against the horizon. At first glance, it seems a ruin, its chimneys cracked, its roof sagging, its gardens strangled by ivy and bramble. But there is something about the house that unsettles more than its decay. Its windows are not merely darkened glass, they are hollow sockets that seem to stare. And though the stone has weathered storms and centuries, the house feels wrong, as though it exists not by endurance, but by defiance. A place that should have collapsed long ago, but refuses to fall. The story of Holloway begins, as most houses of its kind do, with a man who believed fortune could erase sin. Thomas Holloway, industrialist, investor, a man whose hands never dirtied with labor, yet whose wealth was drawn from the calloused palms of others. He built his empire on coal and steel, on machines that ground men to dust and left women widowed. Yet in Derbyshire, he was known as a benefactor. He paid for roads, for schools, for the great church bell that still tolls each Sunday. His charity masked his cruelty as velvet hides the blade. It was in 1817 that Thomas laid the first stone of Holloway Estate. He spared no expense. Granite pulled from quarries in the north, oak beams cut thick and carved to last generations. Every stair polished, every window cut wide to remind the village below who held dominion. The house was not a home, it was a monument to wealth, to power, to a man who believed himself untouchable. Yet what Thomas built was more than stone and mortar. His laborers spoke of unease as they worked the foundations. Tools misplaced themselves. Ropes frayed with no cause. A man fell into the pit and shattered his spine, swearing before his final breath that the earth itself had pushed him. They muttered that the ground beneath Holloway was sour, that it had swallowed blood before, and hungered still. When the family finally moved into the estate, the house seemed to exhale, its halls filled with music, its hearths with fire. Servants moved in a steady rhythm, oiling the gears of a household meant to display triumph. And for a time triumph it was. The Holloways hosted banquets of dazzling light. Wine flowed, laughter echoed, carriages lined the drive. From the outside, it was the image of prosperity. But stone remembers what laughter hides. It began, as it often does, with whispers. Servants spoke of footsteps pacing the upper halls long after the family had gone to bed. Doors opened themselves with slow precision, as though an unseen hand had turned the knob. The great clock in the foyer struck 13, though no weight moved within it. Each time they spoke of it, Thomas silenced them with pay or punishment. He would not allow superstition to stain the image of his creation. Yet Eleanor, Thomas's wife, could not silence what she felt. She was a woman of grace, delicate in health, but with a mind sharper than her husband knew. At first she dismissed the strangeness, the creak of beams, the moan of winter wind. But when she opened her journal at night, her hand wrote words she did not think. Sentences emerged like dictation, phrases that chilled her blood even as she inked them. The walls breathe. The child watches from the stair. You will not leave me. Thomas scoffed when she showed him. He called it the fancies of a nervous woman, an indulgence of imagination. Yet the entries multiplied. Night after night, her handwriting grew jagged, as though her hand fought against her will. She began to sleepwalk, her nightgown trailing through halls she did not recall crossing. Once, she was found standing in the nursery, empty, for no child had ever been born to them, humming a lullaby in a voice that was not her own. The servants grew uneasy. They crossed themselves when Eleanor entered the room. They whispered that she was no longer mistress of the house, but a mouthpiece, that something had claimed her, or worse, that the house itself had chosen her as its tongue. Still, life at Holloway went on. Thomas entertained investors, expanding his empire. He ignored his wife's pale complexion, the shadows deepening under her eyes, the way she recoiled from the touch of her own husband. To admit that something was wrong would be to admit the house he built was more than stone, and Thomas Holloway was not a man who believed in anything greater than himself. But the estate had begun to show its teeth. The roses in the garden bloomed black at their edges. The horses refused the stable, their eyes rolling white with terror at the threshold. Guests reported chills in their bones though the fires roared, and Eleanor's journals, once private, were discovered by a maid who dared peek within. The words inside were no longer English, but spidery glyphs, curling across the page like veins. The maid ran screaming into the night. She never returned. By the time the first decade of Holloway's reign ended, the estate was already whispered about in the village. They said the house was not cursed, as curses fade with time, but conscious, alive in ways men were not meant to understand. It did not haunt because of death. It haunted because of hunger. The Holloways' wealth had insulated them from scandal, but whispers seeped through even the thickest walls. People asked why Eleanor no longer attended church, why her voice cracked when she did speak, as though it carried echoes not her own, why she looked at her husband with such hollow eyes, as if watching not the man but the shadow looming just behind him. And Thomas, proud to the last, ignored it all. That a house like Holloway does not forgive ignorance. It feeds on it. It fattens itself on denial. And every stone, every beam, every inch of soil beneath its foundation swelled with the grief, the cruelty, the silence that bred within its walls. The Holloway Estate should not stand. Yet it does. And if the house is alive, if it consumes despair the way lungs consume air, then I must ask you, what happens when it decides to feed again? Time has a way of turning houses into mirrors. The walls reflect what enters them. They echo footsteps, cradle laughter, and trap sorrow like flies in amber. And so it was with Holloway, where every passing year pressed the family deeper into its grip. Thomas Holloway's wealth expanded with his industries, but within the estate, another legacy was taking root. Eleanor bore him 2 children. The first, William, was sharp and unyielding, with his father's stern brow and calculating eyes. Even as a boy, he carried himself with a gravity beyond his years, eager to please a man who gave love only in expectations. The second, Margaret, was different. Frail in body, pale as the moon, her voice soft yet edged with a peculiar clarity. She did not inherit Thomas's ambition, nor Eleanor's delicate poise. She inherited instead a gift, or a curse, that tethered her to the unseen. From her earliest days, Margaret wandered the corridors alone, her small hands brushing the wallpaper, her gaze fixed not on her nurse but on the corners where shadows gathered thickest. When asked what occupied her mind, she would smile faintly and say, "The woman in the walls." At first, the family dismissed it as a child's fancy, the harmless invention of a lonely imagination. But when doors opened without touch, when mirrors clouded in breathless rooms, when Margaret woke screaming of hands reaching through the cracks, the servants began to whisper. The Holloway Estate was stirring. William, so much his father's son, scoffed at Margaret's visions. He taunted her with cruel logic, telling her ghosts were tricks of weak minds, that the house belonged to Holloways, not phantoms. Yet his cruelty betrayed unease. For though he denied the whispers, he too felt the cold brush in empty rooms, the pressure of unseen eyes upon his back as he studied at night. It was Eleanor who did not laugh, Eleanor who listened to her daughter speak of the woman in the walls, Eleanor who recognized in Margaret's words the same dissonant voice that had begun to fill her own mind years before. Eleanor had grown pale, her health fading like a candle guttering low. Her journals overflowed now with half-legible scrawls, phrases that shifted between her voice and another's. She confided in Margaret, not as a mother to a child, but as a fellow sufferer to one who shares the affliction. "They call when it is dark," Eleanor whispered one evening, her fingers trembling against her daughter Seppa's cheek. "They speak of promises made long before you were born. And when I answer, it does not feel like my own lips that move." Margaret, though young, did not shrink. She pressed her small hand against her mother Sep's and nodded solemnly. "I hear them too. The woman tells me she has been waiting." From that day forward, a bond formed between them, not of nurture, but of shared possession. They moved through the house as if connected by an invisible thread, each flinch mirrored, each shiver echoed. At night, Margaret would crawl into Eleanor's bed, and together they listened to the walls breathe. The servants feared it most. They whispered of Eleanor's decline, how her once bright eyes had dimmed into a hollow stare. They whispered of Margaret's laughter, laughter too knowing, too old for a child. And they whispered of the things found in the garden, birds torn open, their feathers scattered like offerings, a cat disemboweled at the roots of the oak. None saw the hand that did it. None wished to. The estate itself seemed to curdle. The walls wept moisture though no rain had touched them. The chapel bell tolled at midnight, though no hand pulled the rope. Servants left in silence, their wages abandoned, their beds stripped bare. Holloway was consuming not only those who remained within it, but those who dared serve its hunger. Thomas, blind with pride, refused to acknowledge what was unraveling. He demanded obedience, demanded silence. He struck William once across the face for repeating Margaret's tales at table. The boy's cheek swelling beneath the hand, meant to shape him into a man. Thomas's authority filled the house like smoke, suffocating, but it could not hide the rot beneath. It was Eleanor who slipped further away. Her walks lengthened, her eyes vacant, her speech fractured into fragments. Sometimes she would sit for hours in the drawing room, gazing at the empty hearth, her lips moving as though in prayer or conversation. Margaret often sat beside her, her own lips moving too. When asked whom they spoke to, they answered in unison, "The ones who remember." Then came the night of Eleanor Sep's disappearance. Her chamber was found empty at dawn, the sheets cold, the door unlocked. The house had been silent through the night, save for one sound, a low groan, as if the earth itself had shifted beneath the foundation. Margaret was discovered standing barefoot in the hall, her nightdress damp with dew, her eyes wide. "She went below," was all she said. For 2 days, Eleanor was gone. Servants searched the grounds, the moor, the woods beyond. Thomas raged, accusing them of incompetence, threatening dismissal. Yet none dared enter the chapel, the one place where even the bravest would not go after dusk. It was Margaret who led them there. Small hand clutching her father's sleeve, she drew him toward the chapel's heavy doors. Reluctantly, Thomas allowed them to be forced open. The air inside was cold, stifling, heavy with the odor of soil and damp stone. Dust choked the pews and cobwebs laced the altar. The crypt below yawned dark, the air spilling from it colder still. Torches were lit, shadows shivering against carved angels that seemed to weep. There upon the earth floor of the crypt, they found her. Eleanor lay sprawled, her dress torn and stained with soil, as though she had clawed her way from the ground itself. Her hands trembled, her fingernails broken and blackened. Her eyes stared wide but vacant, pupils dilated to ink, as if fixed on something no other could see. Her lips moved, cracked, and bleeding, whispering words none understood. Only fragments escaped the silence. A pact sealed before my time. When Thomas knelt beside her, she recoiled, clutching at the ground as if it would shield her. Her gaze was not of a wife toward her husband, but of a vessel clinging to the one who had filled her. The servants crossed themselves. William turned away, jaw tight with fury and shame. But Margaret stood unflinching, staring down at her mother, with something closer to recognition. And in that moment, the house seemed to breathe again. Not a sigh, but a hunger satisfied, if only for now. Time does not weaken Holloway Estate. It strengthens it. Each year the walls drink deeper, each season pressing grief into its marrow, until the house itself becomes indistinguishable from the family it devours. And as generations shifted, so too did the house choose its new master. Thomas Holloway was not eternal. Wealth, pride, cruelty, none spared him the decay of flesh. His death came suddenly, though some whispered the house hastened it. A fall upon the grand staircase, a neck broken against the polished banister. The official account was accident. The servants called it justice. The mantle of Holloway passed to William, his son, stern even in youth. William had grown into a man of iron temperament and relentless suspicion. Where his father ruled with pride, William ruled with paranoia. He paced the corridors at night, lantern in hand, watching shadows with the intensity of a man certain they concealed enemies. His journals brimmed with calculations, inventories, endless lists, proof to himself that all was ordered, all was controlled. Yet no ink could quiet the dread that pulsed in the timbers above his head. Margaret, his sister, did not ascend beside him. By the time William claimed Holloway, Margaret had become a ghost within her own skin. As a child, she spoke of the woman in the walls. As a young woman, she drew her visions in frantic sketches, parchment after parchment filled with grotesque scenes. The estate swallowing its inhabitants whole, staircases curling into throats, windows that blinked like eyes, the chapel stretching into a mouth that swallowed sunlight. Her hands shook as she drew, yet she could not stop. When asked, she said simply, "The house wants me to remember." London physicians were summoned at William's command, their polished boots echoing in the hall as they examined his sister like a specimen. They spoke of hysteria, of female weakness, of nerves unsettled by grief. They recommended laudanum, rest, confinement. They did not explain the marks carved into her skin. For upon Margaret's arms, her shoulders, even her chest, symbols appeared as though etched by an invisible blade, jagged lines, circles intersecting, sigils no one in the room could decipher. When asked, Margaret denied making them. She wept, swore she awoke with them burning on her flesh. The physicians called it self-infliction, hysteria given form. But William knew the truth in his heart, though he dared not name it aloud. The house was writing upon her. And so, desperate to preserve the Holloway name, William silenced her. He locked Margaret in the west wing, where the curtains rotted and the air grew damp. He rationed her food, kept her from the servants' eyes, forbade her name from being spoken beyond the estate. Better whispered madness, he told himself, than public shame. Yet Margaret Sebb's presence could not be confined. Those who remained in service swore they heard her voice in the night. Thin, breathless, stretched across the corridors, she sang lullabies in languages no one recognized, her tone not frail but commanding. Sometimes her whispers drifted through the floorboards, accompanied by the sound of scratching, as though the walls themselves had begun to breathe her words back into the house. The estate grew colder under William's reign. Fires refused to take. The draft that once came and went now lingered like a permanent shroud. Servants fled without collecting wages, abandoning uniforms, abandoning trunks. Rooms were locked and never opened again. The once great house full of laughter and banquets shrank into a hollow shell where only paranoia and whispers remained. William cursed them all, his servants for their cowardice, his sister for her weakness, his mother for her madness, his father for leaving him with a legacy steeped in shadows. But he never cursed the house. For even William, with his iron will, knew better than to speak against the true master of Holloway. In his desperation, he attempted to reason with it. Alone at night, he stood in the great hall, staring into the darkness above the stairwell, and whispered bargains. He offered loyalty. He offered silence. He even offered his life, if only the estate would leave his bloodline intact. But the house did not answer bargains. It answered only with hunger. Meanwhile, Margaret withered in her wing, starved of food, starved of light. Her body grew thin as paper, but her voice grew stronger. At first it was faint, a whisper behind locked doors. Then it echoed clear, threading itself through the beams and floorboards. Servants who lingered swore her words reached every room, carried by the wood as though the house itself exhaled them. One night William woke to find symbols carved into the walls of his chamber, identical to those etched upon Margaret's flesh. His lantern flickered, smoke staining the ceiling. Beneath the hiss of his own breath, he heard it, his sister's voice, whispering his name. Not from the west wing, but from the very stones surrounding him. William fell to his knees, hands pressed against his ears. He screamed for silence, for the voices to cease. But silence is a mercy Holloway does not grant. By dawn his eyes were bloodshot, his mouth raw from muttered prayers. He dared not enter his sister's chamber, dared not look upon her pale face. Yet he knew the truth. As every Holloway knew, whether they admitted it or not, the estate was not merely cursed. It was conscious, and it was teaching its bloodline the lesson it had always demanded: submission. Madness was not hereditary, it was tutelage. The house was their instructor, and the price of resistance was despair. And though Margaret's body was weak, her voice had become the clearest vessel of Holloway's will. That night, as William lay awake in the dark, her whisper threaded through the corridors once more. Soft, patient, endless. But this time it was not Margaret who spoke. It was the house. Catherine Holloway arrived with laughter in her voice and light in her eyes. The carriage wheels had barely touched the gravel of the long skeletal drive when she pressed her gloved hand against the glass, marveling at the estate her new husband called home. Holloway rose from the fog like a shipwrecked cathedral, its gables jutting like ribs, its chimneys smoking as though exhaling from lungs. She whispered of the promise of restoration, how she would hang bright curtains, how children's voices would fill the echoing halls. But no house that had already decided to claim its inhabitants could ever be reformed. At first Holloway played kind. Fires burned warm. The oak panels gleamed with polish, and the servants, though pale with a weary sort of silence, obeyed her word. Catherine busied herself with arranging parlours, writing invitations to families in Derbyshire, determined to make the house respectable again. William encouraged her efforts with a distracted pride, his mind always fixed on accounts, crops, and the management of a dwindling estate. But in the quiet hours when Catherine walked the corridors alone, she began to feel it. the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back, the strange hush that fell whenever she crossed the threshold of certain rooms. The servants, cautious and evasive, steered her away from the northern wing. They whispered among themselves of the ash room, a chamber barred with iron, where smoke lingered though no hearth had burned in years. When Catherine finally asked directly, the housemaid Anne crossed herself and muttered that it was not her place to say, that only Holloways could open what Holloways had sealed. Catherine pressed further, but the woman only replied with a single sentence, "The house remembers." Weeks later, when William travelled to London on business, Catherine's curiosity overcame caution. Keys hung heavy from her waist. She tried them all, until one turned the lock to the northern room. The smell of soot greeted her, acrid and choking, as if centuries of fire had been trapped without escape. The chamber within was lined floor to ceiling with shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes, journals, hundreds of them. Their spines bore names she knew only faintly from the family portraits: Eleanor, Margaret, others long dead. Some volumes had no names at all, only symbols scrawled like wounds across their covers. She opened one at random. The ink was jagged, blotched with what looked too dark to be rust. The handwriting began orderly, but with each page descended into spirals, loops, and scratched out lines, until the words became unreadable, except for the symbols repeating over and over. Catherine traced them with her fingertip, only to recoil at the sudden chill that lanced through her body. They were the same sigils the servants whispered of, the same marks carved into Margaret Holloway's skin decades before. The deeper Catherine read, the stronger the sense that the house itself had written these words through human hands. Phrases repeated across generations in Eleanor's script, in Margaret's, in William's own hand as a boy. The pact binds us. The ash must be fed. The walls hunger. Each line carried a sense of inevitability, as though to live within Holloway was to be claimed by it, the mind bending until it spoke the house's voice. Her hands trembled as she closed the volume. In that instant she realized something terrifying. The curse was not born from Holloway blood at all. It was the estate itself that consumed, the family merely vessels to prolong its will. Madness had not been inherited, it had been inflicted. Catherine tried to banish the thought, but Holloway would not allow her peace. Days later, her firstborn son was delivered, only to wither in the cradle within weeks. The doctor called it weakness of breath. William called it tragedy. Catherine called it theft. She sat for hours by the tiny coffin, her hand resting on its lid, certain she heard the faintest sigh escaping through the wood, not of her child, but of the house itself exhaling in satisfaction. Her grief hardened into defiance. She returned to the ash room with a lantern, gathered the journals into a heap, and set flame to their edges. Pages curled, ink blistered, and smoke filled the chamber. She thought she heard voices in the rising ash, voices pleading, voices shrieking. For the first time, Holloway seemed afraid. Catherine's chest swelled with triumph. But her victory was short-lived. When she staggered awake the next morning, her throat raw with smoke, she smelled it again, the scent of burning. She rushed to the corridor, heart hammering, only to find the air thick with haze. Curtains smoldered, tapestries rippled as if in a breeze, though no windows were open. She cried out for the servants, but none came. William rushed from his study, furious, demanding to know what she had done. Catherine swore she had set only the journals alight, yet as they ran through the house, every corridor led to another cloud of ash, another phantom flame. And then, as suddenly as it began, the smoke vanished. Not a curtain was singed, not a beam was blackened, yet Catherine's hair was full of soot, her palms streaked with ash. Holloway had shown her its anger, its refusal to be unbound. That night she lay awake beside her husband, staring into the shadows that stretched long across their chamber walls. Somewhere deep within the house, she heard the faint crackle of fire, though no blaze had been lit. and beneath it, softer still, the sound of a child's sigh. Holloway had taken her son, Holloway had consumed generations, and Holloway had no intention of releasing its hold. By dawn, Catherine Sepp's hope was gone. She rose from bed, gazed at the grey light pressing against the windows, and whispered into the silence, "How do you burn a house that burns you first?" The west wing of Holloway Estate had long been sealed. Doors swollen with damp, windows shrouded in dust, and corridors so thick with cobwebs they looked like shrouds. Servants avoided it with an almost religious fear, whispering that the walls there listened too closely, that footsteps followed when none should. Catherine, who had once dismissed such murmurs, now found herself drawn to that forbidden wing with a pull she could neither explain nor resist. It began with a sound, soft at first, like the groan of old timber, but in the stillness of midnight, it formed into rhythm, almost speech. William dismissed her concerns with irritation. "The house settles," he muttered, eyes bloodshot from brandy. Yet Catherine knew the difference between settling wood and a voice that breathed, and so, lantern in hand, she descended the dust-choked hall alone. Behind the final door, locked and bolted with rust, Catherine found what should not have been possible. Margaret Holloway. Not the bright-eyed girl from the portraits. Not the young woman whose descent into madness had been whispered about in William's childhood. No, this Margaret was enduring. She sat in a great chair as though it were a throne, her figure frail as parchment, yet her presence vast. Skin hung like parchment on brittle bones, her veins dark beneath the flesh, but her eyes, those eyes were sharp, glittering, almost luminous, as though they were windows into something beyond human decay. She smiled when Catherine entered. The expression split her face like a wound reopening. So Margaret croaked, her voice, not her own but doubled, as if the walls themselves repeated her words. "The bride comes to sit with the widow." Catherine staggered back, clutching her lantern. You live." Margaret tilted her head, brittle neck creaking audibly. "The house does not permit me to die. Not yet. Not until the vows are complete." Catherine Sepp's throat tightened. "What vows?" The old woman laughed, the sound dry as autumn leaves skittering across stone. "The vows your father-in-law swore, the pact he sealed in ink and blood. He traded years for fortune, his children for stone, his house for a living hunger. And I," she raised a skeletal hand, fingernails blackened and sharp, "I am the bride, wedded not to man but to Holloway itself." The lantern flickered violently. Catherine Sepp's hand shook. "You mean to say you are bound to it, that it keeps you alive?" Margaret leaned forward, her eyes unblinking, her voice dropping into a hiss. "No Holloway escapes. The walls take their due, the bloodline is meat, and the house devours it slowly." Silence pressed against Catherine's chest. She thought of her infant son, stolen by the house before he had ever truly lived. She thought of William, proud and blind, refusing to see the rot behind the estate's grandeur. And she thought of herself, already feeling the noose of Holloway tighten around her throat. Margaret reclined, her voice softening, though it carried still, echoing unnaturally from the plaster. "I hear them, you know, the voices in the stone. They tell me when to wake, when to sleep, when to dream their dreams. I have been here for decades, yet I do not wither fully. The house feeds me just enough to keep me as its bride." Catherine Sepp's stomach churned. "Why tell me this?" Because Margaret rasped, lips twitching in something between a smile and a grimace. "You are next." Before Catherine could respond, Margaret shuddered violently. Her head jerked back against the chair, her jaw locking open in a silent scream. The lantern flame sputtered as though starved of air. And then, with a sound like the final snapping of a bowstring, Margaret collapsed into stillness. Catherine dropped the lantern and rushed forward, gripping the woman's icy hand. There was no breath, no heartbeat. Margaret Holloway was dead. But Holloway was not finished. The house shuddered, as if it had taken a breath. Plaster rained from the ceiling. The glass in the windows of the west wing splintered in unison, a cascade of sharp rain, portraits tilted from their hooks. The floor itself groaned beneath Catherine's knees. The servants came running, faces white, crossing themselves. William roared at them to remain calm, but even his voice trembled. Catherine's eyes did not leave Margaret's body, still seated upright in her chair, eyes open and staring, yet no longer aware. The soul had been taken. Holloway had consumed its bride. That night, Margaret's body was laid out in the chapel, as tradition demanded. Candles flickered, their flames bending unnaturally, guttering as though pushed by unseen breath. The moment the door was sealed, a deep crack split the nave wall. Servants screamed. Some fled the grounds, refusing to remain another night. Catherine lingered, watching the plaster fall in pale chunks across the coffin lid. She understood then that Margaret's death was no release. It was a trigger. The house had claimed her soul, and in doing so had awakened something deeper. When William demanded they leave Holloway for their London townhouse until repairs could be made, Catherine felt her stomach turn cold. She knew what Margaret had meant. Departure was not permitted. Holloway would take what was owed, and if she attempted escape, the price would be multiplied. As she lay awake, listening to the quiet thrum of the house around her, Catherine placed her hand against the wall beside her bed. It pulsed faintly beneath her palm like the beat of a hidden heart. Margaret was gone, yet Holloway lived stronger than ever. And Catherine whispered into the darkness, "If the house owns the dead, what will it demand of the living?" The history of the Holloways is not a straight line but a spiral, each generation looping back into the same suffering, each heir marked not by fortune but by affliction. For every birth within those walls, a shadow descends. For every child who cries their first breath beneath the beams of Holloway, another voice is added to the house's choir of whispers. Catherine Holloway bore children, more than the one who had been stolen in infancy, more than William had ever dared to hope for. Yet each child carried a curse etched deeper than blood, as though the womb itself had been hollowed out by the estate before they were even conceived. The first son, Edward, grew into a clever boy with a sharp tongue. Yet when he reached his 12th year, his nights became haunted by terrors that tore at his sanity. He would wake screaming, his fingernails clawed into the wood of his bedpost, his eyes rolled back as though he stared at something that no one else could see. Servants swore that the boy spoke in a voice not his own, a guttural language of broken syllables that seared their ears. When daylight came, Edward remembered none of it. Then there was Joseph, born sickly, with a strange red mark etched upon his chest, like a symbol seared into him by hands unseen. His body weakened by the year, and by the age of 7 he was found standing in the corridor outside the chapel, hands clasped in prayer, murmuring words in Latin he had never been taught. When Catherine pressed him trembling, he told her he prayed not to God, but to the woman in the walls. Within a month, Joseph's body was found cold in his bed, his lips still moving faintly, whispering prayers to something that had already claimed him. Margaret's prophecy, that the house would take its due, echoed with each child that withered. Catherine clung to faith, desperate to believe that God still heard her. She spent her nights in the chapel, clutching the crucifix, her tears staining the stone floor. But even the chapel bent beneath Holloway's will. She returned one morning to find the altar slick with fresh blood, though no wound had been opened, no body laid there. Another night the crucifix above the nave had twisted, not broken but inverted, its weight hanging impossibly against gravity's pull. When Catherine demanded the servants restore it, none would dare approach. They muttered that the house mocked her prayers, that God had long abandoned the Holloways, leaving them to whatever covenant Thomas had first sealed. Still, she resisted. Letters were penned to her kin, to her father's household beyond the moor. Pleas for refuge, for help, for deliverance. Yet none were answered. When William sent riders to carry the missives, none returned. Their horses were later found at the edge of the moor, reins snapped, saddles empty. No tracks of struggle, no bodies, just silence, as though the men had been lifted clean from the earth. And so Holloway isolated its brood. The estate became a cage that looked outward over Derbyshire, but no longer belonged to the world beyond. Rumours spread among the locals. Farmers and shepherds who crossed too close to Holloway's borders whispered of cries carried on the wind, of figures glimpsed in windows long bricked shut. They claimed the estate was not merely haunted, but alive, a place that eats the living. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the Holloway grounds, lest the house grow hungry for new blood. Catherine aged, her face lined with sorrow. Her hands, once quick with embroidery, trembled too much to hold a needle. Grief hollowed her more efficiently than time. William, meanwhile, had grown gaunt, his ambition spent, his pride rotted into bitterness. He poured himself into brandy, pacing the halls at night, muttering of restoring the Holloway name, though all who bore it were vanishing one by one. Their daughter, Amelia, showed signs by her 14th year of what the house had planned for her. She wrote compulsively in notebooks, filling them with glyphs no one could read, symbols etched with manic precision, identical to those that had scarred Margaret's body decades before. Catherine burned the notebooks in the chapel's hearth, hoping to rid her child of the affliction. Yet the next morning the same symbols were carved into Amelia's skin, not by her own hand, but as though the walls had reached out in the night and written upon her. Catherine's faith broke. She no longer prayed for deliverance, but for the courage to endure. The Bible she had once carried now lay closed upon her bedside table, its pages warped from damp, as though the house itself had wept upon it. It was then, as if in final cruelty, that Holloway erased her. Her name began to vanish from records. Parish ledgers once inked in careful script were found smudged, her entry blurred until it was illegible. Servants who had once spoken her name now faltered, claiming their tongues could not shape the syllables without stumbling. Even William, in his drunken haze, sometimes stared at her as though she were a stranger, muttering, "Who are you?" before stumbling away into the halls. And then one winter evening, Catherine's bed was found empty. No struggle, no signs of departure, only the indentation of her body in the mattress and the faint scent of soil clinging to the sheets. She had not run. She had not died. She had simply been taken. In time, her portrait in the gallery blackened, the canvas rotting in its frame until her face was unrecognizable. Her diaries, once locked away, grew brittle, the ink flaking until her words could not be read. It was as if Holloway had reached into time itself and plucked her thread from the tapestry, leaving behind only silence. The Holloway estate remained. Stone unbroken, timber unmoved, its history devouring individuals, yet keeping itself eternal, each new generation a harvest, each heir another seed, sown in soil, watered with despair. The locals said it was not the Holloways who lived in the house, but the house that lived through them, a bloodline reduced to marrow for its master. And when the west wind carried the cries of children across the moor, the villagers crossed themselves and whispered, "The heirs of Holloway still scream." The year was 1889 when Dr. Alistair Rowan first laid eyes upon Holloway Estate. He had come from London, a man of reason, trained in the hard discipline of history and the precision of architecture. To Rowan, ghost stories were the excess of fevered minds, superstition clung to by those who could not bear the cold indifference of time. Yet when he first saw Holloway rising from the moors, wrapped in its eternal fog, a seed of unease planted itself in his chest. The estate had been abandoned for years. The last Holloway heir had vanished into silence, leaving the manor untended, its windows blind, its chimneys clogged with soot. Ivy clawed its way up the stone, the gate sagged with rust, and the once proud halls stood like ribs of some long-dead beast. Rowan noted these details with the eye of a scholar, yet beneath his observation stirred a subtle dread, the sense that the house was not empty but merely waiting. He had come to Derbyshire under the pretense of study. A grant had been given, funds allocated, his task simple: to catalogue the Holloway archives and produce a monograph on the family's decline. But beneath his professional curiosity was something deeper, though he could not yet name it. The Holloways were a riddle, a bloodline eaten alive by whispers of madness, and Rowan fancied himself the man to untangle myth from truth. The first nights he spent within the estate were uneventful. Dust choked every corner, rats scurried behind panels, and the wind howled through cracked shutters. He lit his lamp, set his papers in order, and began the work of reading. The archives, once thought destroyed, yielded fragments: a letter from Catherine, ink blurred with tears, a ledger in William's hand, each page marked with symbols of uncertain origin, a single journal, half-burned, its margins filled with desperate prayers. Again and again, the same words appeared: pact, due, the woman in the walls. Rowan dismissed them as symptoms of generational illness, the contagion of fear passed from parent to child. He recorded them meticulously, certain they could be explained as the residue of Gothic fancy. Yet each evening as he set aside the papers, he could not help but glance over his shoulder, as though expecting an unseen reader to lean with him over the desk. In the village below he sought testimony. Old men in the tavern crossed themselves at the mention of Holloway. Women warned him not to stay after sundown. One shepherd told him he had seen children's faces staring from the windows, though the house had been empty for decades. Rowan smiled politely, noting their words, but he carried the unease with him back to the manor. It was on the fifth night that he first heard the voices. They came faint at first, woven into the sigh of the wind. A woman's whisper, indistinct, threading through the hall outside his study. He rose, lamp in hand, and followed. The corridors stretched unnaturally long, as though each step birthed another yard of shadow. The whisper drew him to the chapel, where he found the crucifix inverted upon the altar, its weight impossible, its presence accusing. Rowan fled to his chamber, berating himself. Fatigue, nothing more. The suggestion of villagers, the effect of too many nights reading about madness and blood. Yet, when he shut his eyes, he dreamed of walls breathing, the mortar between the stones pulsing as though veins ran through them. He woke to find his pillow damp with soil. Days blurred. He wrote obsessively, cataloguing every entry, every symbol, every broken record of the Holloway line. His rational notes grew frantic, margins filled with words that were not entirely his own. When at last he looked back through his papers, he found drawings, intricate glyphs, carved in ink he did not remember lifting. It was then that he discovered the journal. At first glance, it was another relic of the estate, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. The hand within was sharp, disciplined, a historian's hand. He read eagerly, his breath quickening. The entries recounted the Holloway curse with startling precision: the pact, the heirs, the deaths. They spoke of symbols in the chapel, of servants fleeing, of whispers in the walls. And then Rowan's heart froze. The handwriting was his own. His name appeared at the bottom of an entry, written in the careful script he had learned as a schoolboy. The ink was faded, yet undeniably his. Worse still, the date inscribed upon the page was a century old. He staggered back from the desk, the journal clutched in trembling hands. It could not be. It was a forgery, a trick. Yet the longer he stared, the more certain he became. This was his hand, his words, written long before he had ever walked the halls of Holloway. Shadows shifted in the corners of the room. His reflection in the window lingered a moment too long, eyes narrowing when his own did not. The whisper returned, louder now, curling around him like a lover's breath. "You were always here." Rowan pressed the journal to his chest, shaking his head. "No," he whispered to the empty room. "I came here to study, to observe, to understand." But even as he spoke, another page fluttered open, and there it was, his future written as past. A final entry he had not yet lived, describing his descent into the very madness he now felt gnawing at his mind. The scholar realized then the truth. Holloway was not merely an object of study, it was a devourer of selves, a parasite that consumed memory, identity, and history, bending them into its endless continuity. He was not a visitor. He was prey. The line between investigator and victim dissolved. Holloway had claimed him. And in the silence of the manor, Dr. Alistair Rowan began to understand what every Holloway before him had learned too late. The house does not need your blood to own you. It needs only your name. Rowan's study turns feverish. The journals he deciphers tell not of isolated tragedies but of a single unbroken narrative, a pact struck in shadowed scripture, sealed not with ink but blood. Thomas Holloway had bound his fortune to the estate, not for himself alone but for every heir who would follow. Yet the price was permanence. Their bloodlines sustained the house, and the house in turn consumed their humanity. The deeper Rowan delves, the more his rational framework crumbles. He walks the corridors at night, tracing his fingers along the walls, swearing he feels faint heartbeats pulsing through the stone. The whispers never cease, layered voices of children, women, men, all repeating fragments of scripture and pleas. They are not echoes of the dead, but of the living, imprinted into the estate, as if the very act of despair carved them into its marrow. By lamplight, Rowan discovers hidden blueprints of Holloway. The designs show wings and chambers never built, or perhaps built, then sealed away. Compelled, he breaks through plaster and finds bricked passages. Within, he uncovers heaps of bones clothed in faded garments, journals clutched against rib cages, and walls stained with soot where candles had burned endlessly until the air was gone. But the most disturbing revelation comes when Rowan notices the journal's scripts altering. At first they bore the hands of long-dead Holloways. Now they shift mid-sentence into his own handwriting, recounting thoughts he has not yet had, fears he has not yet admitted. He tries to deny it, yet each page anticipates him, as though the estate is learning, reshaping itself, recording his unraveling in real time. By the end of the chapter, Rowan no longer questions whether the house is alive. He sits in silence, candle guttering low, and whispers into the dark, "What do you want of me?" The walls breathe back. Rowan's resolve fractures as he makes his bid for freedom. He flees into the moor, lantern in hand, but each path folds back on itself. The fog thickens, swallowing the landscape until only the looming silhouette of Holloway remains, its windows glowing faintly as though lit from within by watching eyes. Exhaustion drags him down, and when he stumbles through the threshold once more, it feels less like entering than being drawn back. Time disintegrates. Morning and night lose distinction. Meals are forgotten. Days vanish into a blur of shadows and whispers. In desperation, Rowan descends into the chapel crypt, seeking final answers. There he finds the Holloway dead, not at rest, but sealed in coffins whose lids are scarred with frantic claw marks. Within the deepest recess, Margaret Holloway lies unnaturally preserved, skin stretched waxen over bone. Her eyes remain open, and when Rowan leans close, her lips move soundlessly, forming words he cannot comprehend yet feels within his marrow. Madness takes full hold. Rowan gathers torches and oil, vowing to destroy the parasite. But when he touches flame to timber, the fire sputters, drowns in damp air, and recoils from the walls as if the house itself rejects immolation. The estate will not die. His journals, once orderly accounts, descend into chaos. Words dissolve into loop spirals and the sigils of the original pact. The handwriting is no longer his own. It flows with a manic certainty, continuing long after he has dropped the quill. By the end, Rowan no longer stands apart from the estate. His voice, once skeptical and assured, joins the chorus in the walls, repeating fragments of scripture in endless cycles. The Holloway curse claims him, as it has claimed all before. His name, like theirs, is absorbed into the eternal memory of stone. The Holloway Estate stands where it always has, a silhouette carved against the grey expanse of Derbyshire's fog. Its timbers sag, its chimneys lean, and its windows remain black as eyes gouged from a skull. To the unknowing traveller, it might seem only another ruin left to the appetite of weather and time, but to those who live within a day's walk of it, Holloway is no ruin. It breathes still, though shallowly, and what it breathes out into the hills is enough to make cattle shy from the pastures and birds wheel wide of the estate's borders. The county, long exasperated by rumors and trespassers, chained its doors decades ago. Notices of trespassing fines are nailed to the outer gates, their paper yellowing, their ink fading into illegibility. And yet, though officials and land registries may claim the Holloway Estate is abandoned, the villagers do not believe it is truly empty. For when the wind falls silent, when fog rolls in low and thick, there comes a sound that makes the bravest men falter at their boots scratching. It is faint, as though filtered through soil and stone, but unmistakable. The rhythm is too insistent to be the play of tree branches, too deliberate to be vermin. It comes from within the walls. Some say it is the echo of Margaret Holloway's long confinement, her nails dragging across the plaster of her chamber, even now. Others swear it is the restless dead, Catherine, the infants, the Holloway heirs gnawing for release from their wooden prisons. A few, though fewer every year, whisper that the sound is not of the dead at all, but of something still alive, something that has never died and never will. No one enters Holloway by day, fewer still linger by night. Yet the estate exerts a pull, all the same. Young men dare each other to walk the length of its gates. Children throw stones at its windows, though they never hear them strike glass, only the sound of the stones swallowed as if falling into water. Old women crossing the moor clutch their rosaries tighter when the fog thickens near its hedgerows, muttering prayers that stumble on their lips. The estate does not need to move to ensnare them. It waits, still and patient, until a curious soul draws too close. Of Rowan, the historian, nothing remains in the official record. His family filed inquiries, but no body was ever retrieved. No grave bears his name. The county clerk, when asked, insists Rowan left Derbyshire on a private errand and never returned. But in the whispering of taverns, another story is told that his notes remain within the Holloway library, half-finished, pages crumbling yet wet with ink that never fully dries. Those who claim to have glimpsed them say his words unravel into the same symbols Margaret once carved into her flesh, the same that appeared in the Holloway journals across centuries. They say the handwriting shifts mid-sentence, as though not Rowan but Holloway itself pressed the quill to paper. What remains certain is this: the curse was never broken, it was never meant to be. The bargain struck by Thomas Holloway was not one that could be undone by confession, or fire, or even faith. It was a pact sealed not in blood alone, but in the marrow of the house itself. Holloway became the vessel, and as long as it stands, so too does the contract endure. The estate is not a ruin. It is a womb. Each generation that entered its halls was not devoured, but repurposed, absorbed into the architecture, their fears plastered into its walls, their despair mortared between its stones. It is not haunted by shades of the past. It is the past, gestating, reshaping itself through the madness of those it has claimed. The scratches heard today are not remnants of agony. They are birth pangs. Something is always forming inside. What, then, will be born? Perhaps another heir, though the Holloway name has long since dissolved into obscurity. Perhaps another scholar, drawn by fragments of rumor and unfinished manuscripts. Perhaps a wanderer, lost in fog and desperate for shelter. It matters little who they are. Holloway takes all who enter. It molds them to its pattern, teaching them despair as naturally as a mother teaches her child to speak. And so the house endures generation upon generation. Storms lash against its stones, frost splits its timbers, ivy claws at its facades, yet it does not fall. Roofs sag, but rafters hold, windows shatter, yet darkness replaces the glass. It is not stone that binds it, but hunger. Hunger has no end. There are nights when villagers wake from the same dream. In it they stand before the estate's chained doors, and the chains are not of rusting iron but of living flesh, sinew wrapped tight, pulsing with blood. Within the dream they always hear their own names whispered from inside, as though the house has been waiting for them specifically. Some wake weeping, some wake laughing, their minds unmoored. A few never wake at all, their bodies discovered lifeless, their hands clenched in fists filled with soil, though their bedsheets bear no trace of earth. These dreams are never reported. To speak of them aloud is to invite the estate's attention, and none dare name Holloway casually. They call it the house on the hill, or simply the place. Words are offerings, and the villagers have learned to keep their offerings close. But the house does not require their voices. It has patience enough. Each generation, one or two will come, who cannot resist the pull, the would-be historian, the daring youth, the reckless seeker of legends. Holloway does not need crowds. It needs only one at a time. One is enough to keep the pact alive. One is enough to nourish the womb. And so the story does not end. It cannot. It circles back upon itself, repeating names and symbols, feeding on the same despair it has always fed upon. Those who listen closely say the walls have begun to echo in new tongues now, languages not spoken when Thomas Holloway signed his bargain. It learns as it devours. It grows as it remembers. The estate is eternal, and its patience is greater than stone, greater than time, greater than any bloodline. The Holloways have perished, yet Holloway remains. It always remains. And still, it waits. For though its halls are silent, though its gates rust shut and its gardens drown in weeds, the estate is not sleeping. In the depth of night, when fog hangs low across the moor, if you listen carefully, you will hear it, scratching faint but deliberate, a rhythm that is not random but purposeful. Something is clawing from within. The final truth lingers like frost across the breath. Holloway remembers, Holloway hungers, and Holloway waits.